I treated Alexander from the Alexander family for free for 3 years. I didn't ask for a single penny. The reason is simple. He looks too much like my first love, Christopher, who passed away in high school. Later, he proposed to me. I didn't agree. He chased after me, cornered me against the wall. His eyes were red. Isabella, do you know what the consequences of betraying me would be? I looked at him coldly. I said sharply, you know, you look so submissive now. It's completely different from him. The first time I saw Alexander, he swaggered into my clinic. He called me by my name directly. He wanted me to treat him. I've never seen such an impolite person. He leaned against the doorframe, with his arms crossed over his chest, with a nonchalant smile on his lips. He said lazily, "It's Isabella." When I was writing the medical record, I glanced at him. I found that the arm he was holding had no injuries at all. I'm almost certain he came here to cause trouble on purpose. I winked at him, showing a puzzled expression. He said jokingly, "Isabella, are you flirting with me?" In an instant, my gaze fell on his head. From the temple to the eyes, he asked, "Sir, where do you feel unwell?" The smile at the corner of his mouth became more pronounced. He pointed to his head and said, "It feels a bit uncomfortable here." I guessed correctly. He does have some issues. I dropped out of school to study medicine at 17. I followed my master, Dr. Harrison, to New York City. I have been practicing medicine for 7 years. This is the first time I've encountered a handsome patient with a bit of a screw loose. I licked my dry lips. I asked softly, "May I ask how you would like to be addressed, this patient?" "What should I call you?" He answered briefly, "Alexander." I followed up on his words. "Alexander, how long have you had the headache?" He leaned back, crossed his legs, with his arms crossed over his chest, stared at me. It left me a bit confused. 7 years, he said. I'm particularly sensitive to the number 7, so when he casually mentioned 7 years, my hand holding the pen suddenly paused. I pressed my lips together, looking at him, smiling slightly. "Alexander, you resemble an old friend of mine." I noticed he slightly furrowed his brow. He suddenly stood up with his hand on the back of the chair. He seemed to glance at me with a hint of dissatisfaction. When he left, he came in with great force, but left in anger. However, he still left me a business card. Alexander is a well-known rich kid from the Alexander family. His family background is prominent. We are completely from different worlds, but it just so happens, when his headache struck, his family reached out to me. When I saw him again, he was lying in bed, pale. As soon as he saw me, he told me to leave. Alexander's mom and dad looked at me awkwardly, especially Alexander's mom. She said to me apologetically, "Isabella, I'm really sorry. My son can be quite irritable when he has an episode. I think that's not too bad." At least she didn't directly ask me to leave. "Let's go. Let her go." Alexander was getting more and more impatient. His voice was loud enough to make my ears buzz. I tried to convince myself, but I didn't succeed, especially when I looked at his face. The thought of retreating came up again. All I could think about was how to cure him. I asked Alexander's mom and dad to help hold him down. That way I could give him the injection. During the injection, I stared at Alexander's angry face. I looked left and right. I was feeling anxious inside. Could there really be 2 people who look exactly alike in this world? Could they be twin brothers? "Don't move," I gently reassured him, with warm fingertips. I softly stroked his palm. He suddenly froze. As if he were paralyzed, I lowered my head, focusing intently on giving him the injection. To be honest, I preferred his usual flamboyant and confident demeanor after the injection. I prescribed him a few doses of traditional Chinese medicine. He complained that the medicine was too bitter. "I don't want to drink it." I had a sudden idea. I deliberately added an extra bitter herb. When Alexander took the medicine, "I'll just stand by and watch. Make sure he finishes it." He frowned at the bitterness of the medicine. His jaw was tightly clenched. His expression was serious. I quietly sat aside. My gaze passed through him to another person. After Alexander's migraine improved slightly, he often came to my clinic. I saw him standing still like a guardian. I couldn't help but ask, "Alexander has been quite free lately, hasn't he?" Alexander had a smile at the corner of his mouth. His arms were crossed over his chest. He slightly raised his chin. "The scent of the medicine here is invigorating." I secretly murmured to myself. He casually found a place to sit down. He picked up the medical book on the table and started reading, but he was just too good-looking. I couldn't help but steal a few glances at him. He seemed to notice that I was looking at him. He raised an eyebrow and smiled at me. "If you want to look, just look openly. I'm not charging you for it." I think he's quite strange. His attitude towards me is inconsistent. It's puzzling. I shook my head. I replied to him, "Don't be too self-righteous." He laughed so hard that his chest shook. His eyes were sparkling. Looking at him made my heart race. A patient suddenly came in the afternoon. I was checking his pulse, but he suddenly reached out and touched the back of my hand. I suddenly felt a wave of nausea. I frowned and stared at him. He seemed to act as if he didn't see it. It was even more outrageous. I felt so disgusted that I wanted to vomit. I felt like this scene was familiar, and I remembered it very clearly. I almost picked up a pen to poke him, but someone stopped me. They even helped me push away that filthy hand that touched me. I suddenly felt an inexplicable sense of grievance. My tears were welling up in my eyes. I looked up. My gaze landed on Alexander's face. Alexander frowned deeply. His face was full of anger. He grabbed the harasser's hand and twisted it back forcefully. He used a lot of strength. The veins on his arm were bulging. A scream broke the silence of the clinic. I wiped my tears. I grabbed Alexander's hand and said, "Don't hurt him too badly." Alexander gritted his teeth. He took a few deep breaths. He said darkly, "Get away. I don't want to see you again." The man hurriedly fled in fear. Alexander turned to look at me. His face still carried the lingering anger. I was momentarily stunned. This was the first time someone was so angry for me, sticking up for me like this. I lowered my head. My fingers kept rubbing the hem of my clothes, making my clothes all wrinkled. To be honest, I actually like Alexander a bit, not just because of his looks. Later, Alexander became the signature of my clinic. He held a prominent position in New York City. His reputation was well known. He had both power and wealth. No one dared to offend him easily. However, my clinic was struggling due to the downturn in the traditional Chinese medicine industry. Business was getting worse. I was considering whether I should do some promotion to improve the situation. While I was worrying about it, Alexander gave me an idea. He suggested that I do a live stream to promote traditional Chinese medicine, to popularize knowledge about traditional Chinese medicine. I looked up at him with a puzzled expression. "You think I can do it?" Alexander leaned down close to me. Our breaths intertwined. I momentarily lost my focus. My heartbeat was so loud it felt like drums in my ears. He raised his hand and gently ruffled my hair. He always liked to call me girl. From when we first met, he called me Isabella. Later, he just called me girl. He always said it with pride. Who dares to say my girl isn't capable? From the first day I met him, I noticed he has a strong desire for control. "You say I can, then I will definitely be able to do it." I smiled with the corners of my mouth raised. With my hand supporting my chin, looking into his eyes, he gently patted my head. He pinned my WeChat to the top in front of me. He even changed the note. "Traditional Chinese medicine, Ambassador Isabella." I asked in surprise. "You actually pinned my WeChat to the top." He chuckled softly, "The only pinned contact." I pretended to be unsure. I leaned in closer, wanting to see his phone. Suddenly, I noticed his WeChat page under my chat history. There was also a girl's profile picture. My gaze suddenly paused for a moment. I pretended not to see, also pretended not to care. I comforted myself in my heart. At least the only person he has pinned right now is me. In the second year of helping him with his illness, I finally met the owner of the girl's profile picture that I once saw below mine. She messaged me using Alexander's phone. She said he had a migraine. She asked me to go find him. The address is the bar that Alexander often goes to. I don't drink, and I don't like the smell of alcohol. Alexander has always been aware of this, so every time he comes to see me, he carries a refreshing scent. Because of this, when I received these messages, I suspected that the person messaging might not be him. Nevertheless, I couldn't help but want to go see, so I inexplicably called a car and headed straight to that bar. I hurriedly pushed the door open. Inside, the heavy metal music was deafening. People in the dance floor were twisting their bodies under the flashing lights. I couldn't help but squint. When I opened my eyes again, I saw that familiar face. Next to him is a girl wearing a tank top. It's completely different from my style. I feel plain and ordinary, like plain water, but he insists that I resemble a fragrant jasmine flower. I couldn't argue with him, so I had to remain silent. I felt a bit angry inside, like a pufferfish that's all puffed up. He came over to kiss me. He said it was to cheer me up, but when I saw his sharp gaze, I still avoided it. If he were him, I would do it without hesitation. I would even take the initiative to kiss him. Alexander's eyes exude ease and freedom. He raised his glass and drank it all in one go. People nearby saw this scene and started to cheer. Alexander, you aren't really planning to settle down, are you, Alexander? You really like that ordinary little traditional Chinese medicine doctor. When did you start liking the good girl type? I'm very close to it. I can hear it clearly, but I can't explain why my heart suddenly feels anxious. It feels like being pricked by countless tiny needles. The pretty girl next to me lifted her leg. She directly sat on Alexander's lap from my perspective. The girl lowered her head, as if she were kissing Alexander. A burst of teasing laughter erupted around us. Alexander slightly tilted his head back. He seemed to enjoy the girl's initiative. When I first met him, I had already heard about his romantic escapades. He always loved to hang out in places of pleasure. He is a well-known playboy, but strangely enough, he has never seriously dated anyone. At most, he just engages in flirtation. Some even jokingly call him the flirtation hunter. To be honest, I do enjoy playing this flirtation game with him. I also like how he tries to please me with that handsome face. I fell into a dream filled with regret and guilt. Suddenly, a tear slipped from the corner of my eye. I raised my hand in surprise to wipe it away. Why am I crying for him? He's just a substitute. I pretended not to see this scene. I bit my lip. I wiped away the tears. I turned and left without hesitation, as if I had never been here. A cheer rose again in my ears. Alexander's voice was drowned out, gradually fading from my ears. I wanted to call the passing bartender, to order a glass of vodka, to indulge myself soberly for a moment, but as soon as I opened my mouth, my voice went hoarse. I left the bar, standing by the roadside, feeling the breeze. After returning home, I felt completely dazed. I really wanted to have a long dream. After waking from the dream, I had never known Alexander, but I still liked his face. I've liked him since high school, but I also know he isn't the person I imagined. I picked up the canned beer he bought from the fridge. As soon as I opened it, the bubbles rushed to the top. I was just thinking of drowning my sorrows in alcohol. Suddenly, he called, "I miss you, Isabella." On the other end of the line, the wind howled fiercely. The leaves rustled softly. His voice mingled with the wind. It reached my ears. It felt like cold particles. "I miss you too," I replied. My throat was dry. I forced an unnatural smile on my face. I smiled so much my mouth felt stiff. My tears dried and stuck at the corners of my eyes. I looked a bit disheveled. For the sake of his face, I decided to endure a little longer. After all, he looks like the person I had a crush on in high school. There are rumors outside that I am pursuing him, but I didn't expect. Later, he actually proposed to me. He was wearing an expensive, perfectly tailored suit. On one knee. When he opened the ring box, nervously I licked my dry lips. "Isabella, will you marry me?" I lowered my head. I first glanced at the ring in his hand. Then I looked at the onlookers around. I looked at his face. It gradually overlapped with the face in my memory. There was no warmth left in my gaze. "I do not want to," I said coldly, "because my lover passed away in the summer when he was 17. Alexander looked surprised. "Isabella, what do you mean by that?" I repeated it clearly again. I said it. "I do not want to marry you." I turned around. He grabbed my hand. His tall figure completely overshadowed me. The onlookers nearby began to discuss. "This is really thoughtless. Alexander is a well-known rich kid in New York City. He is wealthy and influential, and he's also handsome. What is this woman thinking? If Alexander gave me this opportunity, it wouldn't even come to her. Hasn't Alexander said before that he doesn't like good girls? This time, he got rejected by the person he dislikes the most. He must be furious. Alexander is still pressing for answers. "Isabella, were you serious about what you just said?" I avoided the question. I didn't answer directly. "Did you hear what the people next to us were saying? Do you know what they are saying about me, Alexander? Do you think I'm happy right now? This life is too hard to bear. I'm suffering even more than Alexander. At least he has a lot of support, but I'm all alone. No one is helping me. All I hear are noisy voices. It's so loud that I feel dizzy. I really wish I could instantly stop hearing this noise. I also wish I had gone blind before I met Alexander. At least then, I wouldn't fall in love with a substitute. Falling in love with him is the biggest mistake I've made in the past 27 years. Since the day I started to have feelings, everything has deviated from the path I originally envisioned. I slowed down my speech. It was as if I wanted him to hear every word I said. Besides, I'm in love with someone else. He proposed to me in front of those friends. Only he could be so carefree. When I turned to leave, he was still in a daze. I didn't look back. I dragged my heavy legs as if they were filled with lead out of the villa. He ran out and cornered me against the wall. His eyes were red. With his hand on his waist, he said, "Isabella, you know what the consequences of betraying me are. You know what the consequences of betraying me will be." I looked at him coldly. The tone was sharp. "You look completely different from him now. It's like you're two different people." Alexander accused me of betraying him. I couldn't help but smile bitterly. Right in front of him, his words hit the most vulnerable part of him. I'm very clear about where his weaknesses lie. I know he desperately wants my love, so I looked at him and said with no expression on my face, "I betrayed you. I never loved you. Where's the betrayal in that? Besides, I fell in love with him first. Not you, Alexander. You should wake up a little. He looks like he's been hurt, fragile like a toy that can shatter with a touch. He is like a contradiction in itself, sometimes as dazzling as the sun, sometimes as fragile as glass. I have feelings for him. It's not without reason." I went home and cried under the covers. It's like saying goodbye to the past. The next day, I gathered my spirits and went to the clinic. As soon as I opened the door, I saw the medicine cabinet had been knocked over. The herbal medicine juice was spilled all over the floor. I stood at the doorway in shock. I took a few steps back. I looked up at the clinic's sign. It was still hanging there just fine. I relaxed. I picked up the phone and called my assistant. I asked her to come help. We spent 3 hours cleaning up the clinic. I sat in front of the medicine cabinet. I checked the time. It was time for the live broadcast. After 2 years of live streaming promotion, I had nearly 100,000 followers. At first, everyone might have wanted to matchmake me with Alexander, but later, I tried to reduce the number of times Alexander appeared in my live streams. Gradually, those who stayed to watch my live broadcasts were mostly enthusiasts of traditional Chinese medicine. I started the live broadcast. As usual, I began to educate the audience. Today, we are going to talk about the herb called He Huan Hua, mimosa flower. He Huan Hua belongs to the category of calming herbs. It can help relieve emotions and promote sleep. It also has the effect of beauty and skin care. Furthermore, it can also clear heat and relieve summer heat, relieve pain, promote blood circulation. Suddenly, with a clang, the sound of glass breaking startled me. I couldn't help but shiver. I thought it was the neighboring store that was being renovated. Just didn't think much about it. Continue to watch the bullet comments on the screen, seriously answering everyone's questions. Suddenly, I heard a sentence float over. "I want to give you a bouquet of mimosa flowers." I felt a bit curious, so I specifically looked up the meaning of mimosa flowers. It turns out its meaning is to express apologies after a couple has a quarrel, hoping to reconcile as before, to eliminate misunderstandings. It's Alexander. I was taken aback for a moment. My first thought was that he was actually watching my live stream. Given his personality, I thought there was no hope left for us, but he actually still wanted to reconcile. I ignored him. I pretended not to see. Suddenly, the sound of breaking glass grew louder. It got closer and closer. It sounded like it was right next to my ear. I rushed outside. I found a group of burly men smashing my clinic with wooden sticks. I shouted, "Stop it! Who sent you here?" I'm sure this isn't Alexander, because he was just trying to be friendly with me in the live stream. The leader of the group pressed a wooden stick against my throat and said, "It was Alexander who sent us. You offended Alexander. There's definitely no good outcome for you. Today, it's your clinic that gets smashed. I don't know where to smash tomorrow." My tears flow down silently. Because love has turned into hate, they are still smashing things continuously. It seems like they are really taking out their anger for Alexander. I stared at them blankly. The wooden stick swung up and down repeatedly. Glass shattered all over the ground. The wooden cabinet was also smashed in. I took a few steps back. I hid in the corner. I dialed the police. Then, I stepped back a few more steps. I found a place where they couldn't see me to start recording video. I didn't expect that. Alexander rushed over. He was holding a bouquet of mimosa flowers. However, when he confronted the leading strong man, he was forced to throw the flowers away. As a result, they were crushed under the strong man's foot. Alexander was extremely angry. He charged forward to fight, but not long after, someone shouted, "This is Alexander." As soon as those people heard this, they hurriedly ran away in a panic. However, they ran into the police at the door. I walked out from the corner. I ignored Alexander's panicked gaze towards me. "Directly hand over the evidence on your phone to the police and take them to check the surveillance footage." Alinder had been completely overlooked by me. At the end, he was still squatting on the ground. staring intently at the crushed mimosa flowers. He originally wanted to reconcile with me, but I will no longer forgive him. I decided not to forgive him, nor will I forgive myself. I closed the clinic, no longer opening for business, because I don't know when danger will come again. I stayed in the dim clinic, light a lamp during the live broadcast. Using the faint light, I continued to share knowledge with everyone, although the situation wasn't great. At least I still have knowledge accompanying me. It's just that in the past few days, some uncomfortable comments appeared in the live chat and comments. Weren't you famous for shipping CP with Alexander before? Who would be interested in your educational content? Wasn't she being promoted as a good girl before? Is it related to Alexander now that she benefits from it? She wants to develop independently. I lowered my head. I closed my eyes. After opening my eyes, I blocked all those comments. Not seeing them makes my heart feel at peace. I simply turned off the live stream. I curled up in the darkness, lost in thought. It's time to leave this city that makes me sad. I dragged my suitcase to the airport. The attendant told me my flight has been delayed. I decided to wait a little longer. After thinking about it, I decided to change my ticket to another city, no matter where, as long as I can leave immediately. But just as I was about to board another flight, the attendant told me again, this flight is also delayed. What a coincidence. I immediately called Alexander. Why did you stop my flight? Alexander's voice is a bit hoarse. Why are you leaving all of a sudden? I smiled coldly. Alexander, this seems to have nothing to do with you. When I used to like him, I would always affectionately call him Alexander or Alex. Now I can only address him politely and distantly as Alexander. Alexander let out a bitter laugh on the other end of the phone. I could hear his voice was a bit choked. Do you really have to leave? I have a terrible headache. Can you come see me? I flatly refused. There are more doctors who can cure you than just me. I walked up to the airport staff. I told her I wanted to refund my ticket. She looked at me. She paused for a moment, somewhat confused. Isabella, have you really thought this through? I replied that I was sure. Then I took a taxi home. I prepared to book a high-speed train ticket to leave in a few days. But I didn't know. Just now, Alexander, who was trying to persuade me over the phone, was having a headache. He was actually squatting at my doorstep. He saw that I had arrived. He raised his hand and rubbed his temples. He wanted to relieve the pain. I simply turned around, carrying my suitcase. I prepared to find a hotel to stay in. He quickly stood up and grabbed my hand. His palm was as cold as ice. I frowned and looked at him. I noticed that his face and lips were pale and bloodless. Alexander licked his dry lips. He said softly, "You're back." I replied coldly, "You're in the wrong place." His tears were hot and burning. They dripped onto my wrist, as if they were going to burn through my skin. It seemed he wanted to use his tears as needles, to stitch up my old wounds that had already cracked. I took a few steps back. Dragging my luggage, I quickly left, but the elevator button seemed to be malfunctioning. No matter how I pressed it, there was no response. I stopped in my tracks. Silently, I turned around. Alexander also stopped. I didn't dare to get any closer. We looked at each other. There were tears in his eyes. I managed a forced smile. Let's just end it like this. Alexander understood. He moved his lips. It seemed he wanted to say something to persuade or argue, but in the end, he just silently nodded in agreement. I no longer considered leaving, because New York City had become my home. It was my home after I turned 17. The memories before I turned 17 are quite vague. I only vaguely remember meeting a sunny and cheerful boy in high school. He always followed behind me, stepping on my shadow. When I noticed him, he would smile at me. His smile was so bright, it seemed to chase away all the unhappiness in my life. I didn't like going home. After school, I always walked slowly. He had his hands in his pockets and walked leisurely behind me. At first, he didn't talk to me. I also didn't dare to speak first, because I was timid. Then one day, I thought he had lost interest in stepping on shadows. He wouldn't play with me anymore. I heard footsteps. I turned around to look. I thought it was him, but it turned out to be a stranger. He walked unsteadily, as if he were drunk. He asked me how to get to my house. I immediately became alert. I asked him what he wanted. "Little girl, your dad owes money. It's only natural for me to come collect the debt." It turns out my dad, who likes to drink, owes money from gambling. He came to collect the debt from my dad. I quickly stepped back a few paces. I tightly gripped the straps of my backpack. I coldly let out Anno. Then I turned and ran. But I hadn't run far. He grabbed my backpack with one hand. There is already a difference in strength between men and women, let alone between an adult man and a minor girl. I fearfully looked back. The smell of alcohol hit me as he opened his mouth. I immediately lowered my head. Teardrops slid down from my eyes. "It's my dad who owes money. It's not me who owes money," I said softly. I hoped to evoke his sympathy for children. My dad has always favored boys over girls. He also likes to gamble and drink. The money at home is not spent on his indulgences. It's used to pay for my brother's tutoring. And I can only work during the summer and winter breaks to earn my tuition. He grabbed my collar. His nose was close to mine, like a dog sniffing its food. I screamed loudly. He covered my mouth. I bit him in fear. He let go of me in pain, but he immediately slapped me again. My face burned with pain from the slap. Teardrops kept falling down. Just then, he appeared. He quickly kicked that person to the ground. Then he punched the other person hard more than 10 times. Then, he walked over to me with concern. He asked, "Are you okay? I'm sorry, I'm late today. A friend asked me to play basketball. I lost track of time. I'm really sorry. I won't let you encounter this situation again next time." I suddenly understood. While wiping my tears, I thought, it turns out he has always been protecting me. But my guardian will always have times when he is not around. Your friend asked you to play basketball. Why didn't you go? I'm not going. I'll take you home first. Okay, I nodded. I walked obediently beside him. We walked side by side, chatting occasionally. He asked, "Is everything at home okay?" I thought for a moment. I replied, "Things are okay. My dad seems to have changed recently. He has started to work seriously to earn money and pay off debts. The previous creditor hasn't come looking for me again." He said casually, "That's great." We exchanged a smile. We walked forward in silence. Suddenly, a person was standing ahead. It was that creditor from last time. He was followed by a few burly men. He quickly passed by me, blocking my way. I looked at him nervously. I asked, "Should we call the police?" He turned and nodded at me. I immediately took out my old phone and started dialing, but it seemed like the people over there noticed our actions. They immediately threw a stick at us. I was startled. I quickly stepped back a few paces. Those men rushed up to try to grab my phone. He immediately stood in front of me to help me deal with the situation. I had just connected the call and had only said hello when my phone was snatched away and thrown to the ground. The screen shattered into pieces. I fell to the ground. I turned to look for him. I saw him facing 3 people alone. I didn't want to drag him down, so I grabbed something and threw it at the person who was grabbing me. "Isabella, be careful." He rushed over. He blocked the wooden stick that was coming at me. He was already injured, especially his knee. He couldn't stand. He fell to the ground. His knee hit the ground. Those people saw that the situation was not right. They immediately ran away. Only she and her young man were left in the dim alley. He couldn't hold on. He fell into a pool of blood. I quickly held him in my arms. I reached out to feel his faint breath. He said, "Don't cry. If you cry, your face will look bad." I watched the ambulance take him away. I chased after it desperately, but I couldn't catch up. I could only sit on the ground and cry loudly. Suddenly, I thought of going home to make him some soup for him to drink when he wakes up. I hurried home to prepare the soup. I found that no one was home. I shouted for my dad and my brother. No one responded to me. I quickly ran to check my saved pocket money. Sure enough, it was all taken away. They both ran away. It was just me left here. I gritted my teeth. I wiped my tears. I started to make soup and cook. I prepared to take it to him. When I arrived at the hospital and inquired, I learned that the boy who was brought in had already passed away. I suddenly felt dizzy. Everything went black. I fainted directly on the ground. After that, I had a high fever. The fever made me delirious. I lost important memories from my 17th year. Now I only remember his appearance, but I can't recall his name. Later, I met a kind and friendly old Chinese doctor, Dr. Harrison. He asked me if I was willing to study medicine with him. At that time, I was all alone. The future was completely uncertain, so I nodded and agreed. After dropping out, I went to New York City to study medicine. 10 years have passed. When I encountered that creditor, Mr. Thompson, again in New York City, I felt as if I was nailed to the spot, unable to move. 10 years have passed. I finally got out. His tone seemed a bit unserious. He asked, "What do you mean by get out?" I didn't understand. Then he looked at me with an uncomfortable gaze. He said, "Don't you know, the guy who took the hit for me before sent us all to prison. He's still alive." I suddenly felt a bit short of breath. I felt both happy and guilty inside. As long as he's alive, that's good. As long as he's alive, that's good. I quickly asked, "Even if he hates us, do you know where he is now?" "How could you not know in New York City?" It's surprising that some people don't recognize the big shot from the Alexander family. Known as Alexander, the Alexander, he just woke up in the hospital. The first thing he did was send us to jail. Don't you realize you've made friends with such an influential person? I'm not sure. I really can't remember. I have no impression of him at all. I only remember his appearance. But why is he specifically Alexander? I turned to find Alexander. But that person blocked my way. His smile was unsettling. It felt like the past was repeating itself. I struggled to break free from his grip. I scratched and bit. I asked him why he still wouldn't let me go. He said, "Since you have nothing to do with Alexander, then it's simple. I can't move him, but I can take out my frustration from 10 years in prison on you." I'm about to break down. How did it end up like this? I kicked him hard. He screamed in pain. I immediately ran forward without hesitation. He has a knife in his hand. I saw it, but I wasn't sure what he would do to me next. After turning out of the residential building, I saw Alexander standing in front of the car. His face was even paler than before. I rushed into his arms, continuously apologizing. I'm sorry. He helped me up from his arms. He blinked. I wanted to reach out and touch his face, but he gently pulled me back, hiding me behind him. He saw that person. He directly asked, "You came out?" "Yeah, it's been 10 years. You have grown from a 17-year-old child." After he finished speaking, he picked up the knife and lunged at me. His eyes were fierce. I pulled Alexander and quickly stepped back. My palms were sweaty. Alexander's body swayed slightly. That's when I understood why he always had migraines. It turns out, 10 years ago, he was injured in the back of his head by a wooden stick. Alexander asked me to call the police. This scene is exactly the same as it was 10 years ago. I was scared, worried that 10 years later, I would experience the pain of a decade ago again, afraid that Alexander would disappear from my life once more. I particularly hate amnesia. I even loathe it. Alexander fought him barehanded, eventually subduing him and pinning him to the ground. The man had a knife in his hand. He almost stabbed Alexander's face and eyes. I was so nervous that my hands were shaking. I even pressed the wrong number while dialing. After much effort, I finally got through to the police. Suddenly, I heard Alexander let out a muffled groan. His head hit the ground heavily. I was so scared that my heart was in chaos. I quickly reported the address. "Please, police, come quickly. Please hurry and save Alexander. He can barely hold on." The man tightly gripped the knife in his hand. He desperately lunged at the fallen Alexander. Alexander held his aching and numb head. He dodged to the side, causing the man to miss. I panicked. I grabbed my bag and swung it hard at his head. He stared at me with wide eyes. I was so scared I could hardly breathe. My legs went weak as I stepped back. Suddenly, Alexander jumped up from the ground. He grabbed the man's neck. The two of them started wrestling again. Suddenly, the sound of a police siren rang in my ears. The man was startled by the sound. It seemed he wanted to go down with Alexander, but he couldn't find a flaw in Alexander, so he turned his attention to me. I frowned and dodged. Unexpectedly, Alexander was facing away from me. He stood in front of me. I suddenly looked up. My hands and feet were cold. I saw the police rush over and catch the murderer. The police were quite quick this time. The knife stabbed below his chest. Blood kept flowing, but he still spoke in such a relaxed tone, as if he were chatting about the weather. He didn't turn around, worried that his injuries would scare me. He just said to me, "Isabella, close your eyes." I stared at him blankly. He smiled and said, "I almost forgot, you're still mad at me. You won't even listen to me." He raised his hand to cover his mouth. He coughed lightly. Then with a thud, he collapsed to the ground. He called out softly, "Alexander, Alexander, look at me. Open your eyes and look at me." I gently held Alexander's head. His fingers trembled as they touched his eyebrows and eyes. Hot tears rolled down onto his forehead. He weakly opened his eyes. "Tell me not to feel guilty or sad." He also said he opened a new clinic for me in Chicago. "Let me leave New York City, this place that makes me sad." My ears started buzzing again. Tears flowed uncontrollably. My heart was filled with sadness and regret. I lowered my head to kiss him, sliding slowly from his forehead to his lips. This was our first kiss. I have never looked for a substitute. It has always been Alexander that I truly liked and loved. It has always been Alexander. The person who harmed Alexander has already been punished by the law. The court sentenced him to 20 years in prison, but Alexander's parents do not accept this outcome. Alexander was their only child. He was supposed to have a bright future, to become the envy of everyone, but now he lies in a hospital bed, in a coma. Overnight, Alexander's mom and dad's hair has turned quite a bit gray. They hired the best lawyer in New York City for the lawsuit, but the final verdict changed from a 20-year sentence to life imprisonment. That day, I sat by Alexander's hospital bed. I wiped his face with a towel. I talked to him about my life during the years he was gone. I also told him the outcome of the trial. His fingers would occasionally move. Seeing that, I immediately ran to call the doctor with joy. I would also call Alexander's mom and dad to share this good news. But each time the joy was very short-lived. During this time, I stayed at the hospital with Alexander. Many friends also came to visit him. They were all a bit surprised to see me. I never expected that in the end, I would be with Alexander. The girl Sophia, who once messaged me from Alexander's phone, also came. Close by, I finally got a clear look at her. When her brows and eyes weren't smiling, there is about 50 to 60% resemblance to me. I feel a bit ridiculous inside, but she looked at me for a while. The corners of her mouth slightly lifted. She smiled. She told me, Alexander has been looking for me for 7 years, and she found the opportunity to get close to Alexander during this time. When Alexander is drunk and his consciousness is hazy, he would look at her face and call my name, but since I appeared, Alexander has lost interest in her. She feels jealous, deliberately provoking me, making me mistakenly believe that while Alexander likes me, he is also having an ambiguous relationship with someone else. Her scheme succeeded. That day I was feeling down. I left in a daze. After I left, Alexander was furious. He told our group to get lost. He even wanted to cut ties with us. I blankly raised my head, recalling that night. Alexander told me he misses me. I thought he was detached from the fragrance of roses. Suddenly, I remembered my jasmine. I realized I had misunderstood. I had been focused on Alexander. He had his eyes closed. I imagined what it would be like when he opened his eyes, his hands motionless. I imagined the scene of him holding my hand after waking up. How much longer do I have to wait, Alexander? I held his hand. My forehead rested on the back of his hand. In my heart, I kept hoping he would wake up. His fingers moved slightly. I quickly looked over. He opened his eyes, but his gaze seemed confused and vacant. Alexander, you're awake. He didn't say anything. Wearing a loose hospital gown, his body was noticeably thinner than before. He lay there quietly, like a puppet. I excitedly ran to call the doctor. The doctor explained that this is a normal reaction for a person in a vegetative state. He can respond to external stimuli, but he hasn't truly regained consciousness. 1 month, 2 months. Time passed day by day. I can no longer remember exactly how long it has been. I only noticed that Alexander opened his eyes. He started to cough, and even sneezed. Aside from that, he showed no signs of waking up at all. Alexander's mom and dad spent a lot of money. They also used their connections. They found an authoritative expert abroad to treat him, and planned to transfer him to a hospital overseas for treatment, as long as there is a glimmer of hope. I didn't want to give up, so I begged them to take me along. I promised to take good care of Alexander, but Alexander's mom asked me, if Alexander never wakes up, what should I do? Alexander actually hoped I would leave New York City and start a new life. I didn't listen to Alexander. I secretly bought an economy class ticket on the same flight and followed him. Alexander's mom and dad can't do anything about me, so I had to sit next to Alexander. I'm working abroad in a strange place to earn money. At the same time, I have to take care of Alexander in the hospital. Experts say he might wake up, but we don't know how long it will take. This is completely an unknown factor. The experts' words gave the 3 of us a bit of reassurance. At least there is a possibility of waking up. Although I have been disappointed many times already, but I still hold onto a glimmer of hope. He might wake up, maybe tomorrow. Maybe it will take several more days.